are going to finish up with muscle by talking about a new concept related to our muscles, which is skeletal muscle metabolism. And I'll also do a brief tidbit on what smooth muscle looks like at the end, which we'll come back to when we start talking about blood vessels eventually. So we'll differentiate our different types of muscles before we get into the heart. Okay, so we're talking about metabolic demands when we're talking about the metabolism going on in our skeletal muscle. We're going to be talking about different types of fibers in skeletal muscle that are partially going to be divided by the type of metabolism that they're specialized for. So hopefully we remember something about metabolism overall, right? So metabolism in our bodies, mainly glucose metabolism. So we get glucose either from the blood, from breaking down glycogen, or if we're in that post-absorptive state, maybe we're doing some glyconeogenesis, making new glucose. Okay. We enter glycolysis, where we break our glucose molecule in half and eventually make pyruvate. And then in normal aerobic cellular respiration, we continue into our Krebs cycle, where we take this acetyl-CoA that we make out of our pyruvate, put into this cycle, and then we put that into oxidative phosphorylation, which is our electron transport chain, and allowing a bunch of protons or hydrogen ions to flow across that inner membrane of the mitochondria, creating a lot of ATP. That's what we usually have happening. And remember that the main places we have ATP made, we get 2 ATP here from glycolysis, we get another 2 from our 2 cycles of the Krebs cycle, and we get a lot, 30-ish, from oxidative phosphorylation. Other thing we want to remember here, just a tidbit as we're thinking about muscles, is that this whole process only happens in the presence of oxygen in aerobic cellular respiration. If we don't have enough oxygen, we have to do the side process. So we can still do glycolysis, we can still make these 2 net ATP, but we can't go into the rest of this kind of flow down. So we make pyruvate into lactate or lactic acid so that we can just kind of cycle through glycolysis over and over again. So we still have ATP, even if we don't have oxygen. Okay. So now that we're thinking about muscles, we're thinking about actually using the ATP, right? So we've seen the cross-bridge cycle, which is our way that we contract those sarcomeres, requires ATP so that we can unbind the actin and myosin. We hydrolyze the ATP to put our myosin into its high energy state so that we can do another round of the cross-bridge cycle. Okay. So now that we're going to be thinking about fiber types and what the muscle cells are doing in order to contract, we're going to be thinking about where that ATP comes from. Okay. So the ATP generation, like how we make the ATP, is going to vary based on what kind of exercise we're doing, how long we've been doing it for, and what kind of fiber type we're talking about. So like specifically what named muscle we're in, and specifically which motor unit in that named muscle we're talking about. Our muscles overall need ATP, but they can get it from different places through different parts of this cycle. So they can go through the whole thing all the way to oxidative phosphorylation using oxygen. They can do this lactic acid production and just cycle through glycolysis over and over again. We actually have another source of ATP that we're thinking about with muscles specifically, which is that they can create ATP out of something called creatinine phosphate. They can use that to phosphorylize ADP. So that's our kind of new metabolic concept that we're going to think about with respect to our muscles. Okay. So we're going to talk about the creatine phosphate system. So this looks different than the metabolic pathways we've been talking about. But what we want to know here is, so our cells at rest They do have some ATP in them, right? They're not totally empty of ATP on the daily, but they don't have a lot of ATP. So if you start exercising, if you start doing stuff, you start contracting your muscles, they run out of ATP real fast. And you keep using ATP, so they're going to need to get it from somewhere. Now, to start doing our whole metabolic process actually takes a little bit of time. Okay? So we have this kind of jump start system to get us more ATP right at the beginning without doing all these metabolic pathways. So you have this molecule, creatinine phosphate, hanging out in your muscle cells. And this equation is at equilibrium. So we have creatinine phosphate and ADP being converted to creatinine and ATP and back. So it's going back and forth. At equilibrium, our enzyme here is creatinine kinase. But as we start to use up our ATP, so we start to use it up so we can like cross it out over here. The way chemical equations work and equilibrium works is that now we have less of this. So the reaction is going to start proceeding to the right. So this is going to take over. So we're kind of making more ATP because we've drained the ATP on this side of the equation. So early on, when we're using our muscle cells, when we're contracting our muscles, we're basically using this creatinine phosphate to make ATP by turning the creatinine phosphate into creatinine, and then that phosphate is getting tagged on to the ADP. So this is just happening because of the law of mass action and the way chemical reactions work, right? So whenever we have more of something, it goes towards the side, we have less of it. So this can supply like 5 times the amount of ATP that you normally have at rest through this process. So we think about this as like extra ATP that we have on tap initially. So when people take like creatinine supplements, they're trying to increase the amount of creatinine to give themselves a little more energy here, which does kind of work. We don't totally know exactly how much it works. There are some negative feedback effects here, but it does seem to do something, right? Some of that is also probably the caffeine that's contained in a lot of the supplements. So if we're thinking about what type of energy production we have happening over time, let's start with what's happening during like light exercise. You're exercising a little bit, but you're not sort of pedal to the floor, right? You're maybe planning to exercise for a long time. So here on the x-axis, we see time. So 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, 4 minute. The creatinine phosphate is our method of ATP production, as we can see right at the beginning, right? So that first like half a minute here, that's when we're using creatinine phosphate mainly. We use it up pretty quick. So it can make a lot of ATP for us right at the beginning, but it's just to get us started as we start to get these other processes underway. So the next thing that we have happen is that we start to see our other methods of making ATP taking over. So here we see our anaerobic glycolysis. So that's the one that makes lactic acid out of the pyruvate. But we can see that what we stabilize into in light exercise is oxidative phosphorylation. Right, so we're gonna get ourselves in a groove with enough of the enzymes to do our full process of oxidative phosphorylation, so that aerobic cellular respiration, where we get a lot of ATP from the electron transport chain, pushing those hydrogen ions into that intermembrane space and then allowing them to flow through the ATP synthase. So first place that we're usually getting glucose for this process is from glycogen stores. Mobilizing glycogen stores takes a while. You have to get it into the blood, and then you have to get it into the muscle as well. So you're probably not going to get those glycogen stores effectively into your muscles for potentially up to like 30 minutes. After we run out of glycogen stores, we start using fatty acids to fuel this. So we start doing that beta oxidation. We're never going to mention that again. Really, we talked about it a little bit in metabolism, but it's kind of at the end of this process, after we use up circulating glucose and glycogen, that we move on to using those fatty acids. Now, because we're ultimately going to be using mainly oxidative phosphorylation in light to moderate activity, this means that we need to have oxygen, right? Oxidative phosphorylation, aerobic respiration requires oxygen, that final electron acceptor at the end of this process. If we don't have oxygen, the whole system backs up. We can't do it. So when we're looking at the fibers that are going to be using this oxidative phosphorylation method of producing energy, we're going to expect to see that they're specialized to get oxygen and to use oxygen. Okay, so that's kind of a bit for 15 minutes from now, maybe. Okay. So light to moderate intensity, you need to keep your oxygen supply adequate. So you physically do different things to get oxygen to your muscle cells. Right? You start breathing faster, moving deeper. So you're increasing your ventilation. You increase your heart rate so that blood pumps faster. So you're getting more oxygen into the blood by breathing more. And then that blood is getting to your muscles faster because your heart is beating more often and harder. And the blood vessels to your muscles dilate. So they get wider, their diameter grows, which means that blood flows there faster and easier as well. So all of this is happening as you are exercising. Now, in heavy intensity exercise, you're putting everything you got into it immediately. We have a different kind of situation. So we still kickstart with creatinine. You can see this curve looks exactly the same for the creatinine, right? So that first half a minute to a minute, we're using up all the creatinine that we can use in those muscle cells. Next, we see a peak in anaerobic glycolysis, but that's what we keep using for our whole heavy intensity exercise. So we're really going to be specialized for anaerobic glycolysis in muscle fibers that are adapted for heavy intensity activity. So they can do a little bit of oxidative phosphorylation. You do still see a little blue line there at the bottom, but it's not a major component of how they're producing energy. So this is partially going to be because it's quicker, right? If you only have to go through that first step of glycolysis, right? You just go through it over and over again. It's quicker. And also, you don't have to get oxygen to those muscle cells, right? So that also means you can mobilize this quicker and you don't have these same needs. And we'll see that there are some physical differences in like the fiber types that will be related to this as well. So for heavy intensity activity, we're primarily going to be using anaerobic glycolysis to make our ATP, which means that we're going to be converting pyruvate to lactate. We're just doing glycolysis. We're not going to the Krebs cycle. We're not going into oxidative phosphorylation. So we can produce energy quickly in the absence of oxygen, but we're going to have lactic acid buildup. And we're not getting as much energy out of glycolysis as we would if we went through that full, longer, slower process. So that brings us to our skeletal muscle fiber types. So we're going to classify different muscle fibers based on how fast they contract and how they're getting their ATP. So different muscle fibers and different motor units are going to be adapted for different types of activity. So we saw before when we were thinking about those motor units that we had the small ones for little delicate activities. We have the big motor It's for big, strong activities. When we look at those muscle fibers, we'll see that they are likewise adapted for the type of activity that you're going to be using them for. If we think about named muscles, we've seen named muscles go different places, so they are specialized for different tasks as well, right? Like your finger muscles versus your quads or your calf muscles or something, they're doing different things. So when we're looking at any named muscle, we'll expect to see a mixture of fiber types, but it's likely that one or the other fiber type is going to predominate because of the different usage of those muscles. So when we're thinking about separating these skeletal muscle fiber types, we're going to be thinking about, do they contract quickly or slowly? So we're going to have fast and slow fibers. And then we're going to have how they are producing ATP. So we're going to have oxidative fibers and glycolytic fibers. And when we describe a muscle fiber overall, we'll specify both of these two things, whether they're fast or slow, and whether they're oxidative or glycolytic. So just a reminder, when we're looking at our cross-bridge cycle, so we have our myosin and our actin binding, we have ATP coming in, and then ATP gets hydrolyzed up here before we start into our next cross-bridge cycle. It's this step, the ATP hydrolysis, differences in this process because of differences in type of myosin is what's going to differentiate our fast from our slow fibers. So we're going to be able to have fast twitch or slow twitch happening in any given muscle fiber, and it's going to be determined by how fast we're able to hydrolyze that ATP. Because if we can do it faster, we have a more effective way to break down that ATP. We can get through more cross-bridge cycles, which means we can generate our tension quicker. So in technical terms, we say that the contraction velocity depends on the rate of myosin ATPase activity. So how fast we can contract those sarcomeres depends on how effective that myosin ATPase, that enzyme, is at breaking down ATP. So in a fast twitch fiber, we're going to have faster cross-bridge cycling because we're going to have faster, more effective myosin ATPase. This also means that these fibers will relax more rapidly. In our slow twitch fibers, we're going to have this whole cycle going slower because we're going to have a slower hydrolysis of ATP. These fibers are going to take a bit longer to relax. So we can see some named muscles and how they contract and what kind of speed. So you'll see here, starting this first one, this is our extraocular muscles, so our eye muscles. You'll see that they only take, like, where's that peak? Say 20 milliseconds to contract. So are they going to be fast twitch or slow twitch fibers, do you think? Yeah, exactly. They're the first ones to contract here on this graph. They're going to be maybe fast twitch fibers. And that's important because it's really important that you can move your eyes very quickly, right? It's really important that you can follow with your gaze someone running or a ball being thrown or something, right? It's really important to how we function. By contrast, some of our calf muscles, so if you've been in lab 4, you've seen the gastrocnemius and the soleus below it. You'll see that they are contracting slower, right? So we have kind of an intermediate gastrocnemius. We have a really slow soleus here. So we'll see that they take a little longer to contract than our extraocular muscles did, than our eye muscle. And they're also taking longer to relax. So specifically, let's look at that soleus, right? It takes a long time for the soleus to relax compared to, for example, our extraocular muscle. So the fast twitch starts fast, but it also ends fast. We have fast and slow fibers, depending on whether they're twitching quickly or slowly. And that's depending on what type of myosin ATPase they have. Now we're going to think about glycolytic versus oxidative fibers before we put the two concepts together. So glycolytic fiber tells you what it does, right? So a glycolytic fiber does glycolysis. It's going to be adapted. We're doing a lot of glycolysis. So this fiber, here, is it going to need oxygen? It's going to need a lot of oxygen supply here. We're trying to do glycolysis. No, right? See some head shaking. Yeah. So glycolytic fibers are predominantly doing anaerobic glycolysis. So they don't need oxygen because they're not getting to that final oxidative phosphorylation step. They're not running their electron transport chain. They don't need oxygen as that final electron acceptor. This means that if you look at them physically, you would see different structures than if they were doing a lot of aerobic respiration. So where does glycolysis happen? Does anybody remember? What part of the cell? Are we in an organelle? Just yes or no? No, we're not in an organelle. So glycolysis is happening out in the cytosol. So just in that fluid inside the cell. We don't even have to go into the mitochondria to do the glycolysis. If you were looking at a glycolytic fiber under a microscope, you didn't see very many mitochondria. It's not using them. It doesn't need them. Okay? So that's going to be a physical difference between our glycolytic fibers and the oxidative fibers that we'll see next. If we were to measure what is in that cytosol, we would notice that there's a lot of glycolytic enzymes there. So we didn't name any of the specific enzymes that were involved in metabolism, but remember that there were technically a lot more steps that we talked about. They're each mediated by an enzyme. So we have a lot more of the ones involved with glycolysis. These fibers are also going to have high glycogen stores, so they can rapidly get a bunch of glucose to those glycolytic, into that glycolysis process. And these last two ones take a little extra step of thinking to understand how that's related to glycolysis. So let's start with this large diameter. So if you have a larger cell versus a smaller cell, think about the ratio of like the surface of the cell to the volume of the cell, right? Which one has more surface area per volume? If you like divided those numbers. Yeah. The smaller one, even though if you were to measure it in like numerical numbers, the surface area might be a smaller number. There's more surface area per volume. So what this means is that in a large diameter cell versus a small diameter cell, that small one basically has more membrane for oxygen to bump into, and then that oxygen doesn't have to move as far to get into the mitochondria. So glycolytic fibers can be larger in diameter, so bigger, because they don't need to specialize for soaking up oxygen, right? They don't care that they don't have all that much surface area and that the oxygen would have to go really far to get into a mitochondria, because they're not doing that part anyway. So that's why our glycolytic fibers are able to have a large diameter, which you'll see is going to be related to their function as well. So secondly, quick to fatigue. So what do we remember about that process? So if we're doing glycolysis over and over again, what's that byproduct that we're producing? Yeah, the lactic acid, the lactate. So as we start to build that up, these fibers are going to be quicker to fatigue than if we weren't building up a bunch of lactic acid. So let's compare that to the oxidative fibers. Let's see if I have them click on and on. So oxidative fibers, what type of ATP production do you think they're going to do? Oxidative phosphorylation, right? So it's in the name. Oxidative fibers do oxidative phosphorylation, which is the electron transport chain, plus the actual flow of those protons through the ATP synthase. That's the oxidative phosphorylation part. This means that they need oxygen and they need mitochondria. So that electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation steps are inside the mitochondria. So it's the Krebs cycle. So we're shuffling our pyruvate into the mitochondria and doing those later steps of metabolism in the mitochondria. If we were looking at two fibers, a glycolytic fiber and an oxidative fiber, and you had to decide which was which, you could count up those mitochondria, see which one has more. One that has more would be your oxidative fiber. I also have an additional chemical that we haven't seen before. So they have something called myoglobin in them. Myoglobin is red in color. And what it does is it stores oxygen. So they basically have an oxygen reserve in them, storing up oxygen so that if you haven't sped up your breathing and your heart enough yet, but you're trying to do a bunch of oxidative phosphorylation, you kind of have oxygen on tap. So as you're eating your turkey, if you eat turkey, this is why white meat and dark meat are different colors. Partially it's because of the myoglobin. That myoglobin gives muscle fibers a darker color if we're looking at oxidative fibers. You can study at the dinner table. So again, related to the need for oxygen, those oxidative fibers, they're going to have lots of capillaries going to them. They need lots of blood flow because they need lots of oxygen. They're smaller in diameter because of that relationship of surface area to volume. They want to soak up a lot of oxygen, so that oxygen needs to bump into the cell membrane. So we have a bunch of cell membrane, and the oxygen then doesn't have to travel very far to get into the mitochondria. Because oxygen isn't actively transported, it's nonpolar, so it just has to diffuse through our plasma membrane. So we can't like pull it into a cell. The way we increase the ability to get oxygen in to increase the amount of surface area for the volume of the cell. Finally, these fibers are a little more resistant to fatigue than our glycolytic fibers are. We don't have that buildup of lactic acid here. So we can keep using those oxidative fibers for exercise, for contraction, for a longer time than our glycolytic fibers. Okay. So now we're combining together our slow versus fast and our oxidative versus glycolytic. You might think that would give us 4 categories, but actually we do not have slow glycolytic fibers. So all glycolytic fibers have fast myosin. They're all adapted for like quick, strong contractions, basically. But our oxidative fibers, we have slow ones and we have fast ones. So you can have a muscle cell that reacts slowly but is using oxygen. You can also have one that reacts quickly and is using oxygen. So, beginning with their properties, we're just going to combine basically those lists, kind of, right? So a slow oxidative fiber is going to have low myosin ATPase activity. It's going to be a little more ineffective at hydrolyzing ATP, has this slow form of myosin. It goes through fewer cross-bridge cycles per minute. Those twitches take longer to form and they relax more slowly. But they're going to have high oxidative capacity that uses oxygen, and aerobic. which means they need blood, so they have lots of capillaries. They need mitochondria, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do oxidative phosphorylation, where oxidative phosphorylation happens. And they have myoglobin, giving them that red color, because they have this kind of extra reserve for oxygen, so that if you don't have enough oxygen coming to that cell quite yet through the bloodstream, you can still do oxidative phosphorylation. And they're small in diameter, so that they have a small diffusional barrier. That's the technical way of saying that it's easier for oxygen to diffuse in, to get into them and into the mitochondria. Because they are small in diameter, this means that they are also going to produce little tension. So this is what we want to link up with our idea of motor units and recruitment from our last unit. So our small motor units, right, or for those fine, delicate movements that we start out with. And this is partially because these fibers, right, they're smaller in diameter. We know one of the ways that we can make muscles contract harder is to layer lots of myofibrils together. So like have lots of sarcomeres in parallel. But if we have a skinny little muscle cell, we don't have enough physical space to put a bunch of those myofibrils in parallel. So this small diameter helps them get oxygen in, but the sort of downside of that is it can't fit as much ability to contract in there. So those are both related to this physical property, their small diameter. And they fatigue slowly because that's related to that property of this low myosin ATPase activity and this oxidative phosphorylation fiber type, right? So you can use them for longer. Takes them longer to run out of juice. Next, we have our fast glycolytic fibers. So they have high myosin ATPase activity. So they have that more effective form of myosin that's more effective at quickly breaking apart the ATP so that we can quickly cycle through more cross-bridge cycles per minute. Okay. They're glycolytic fibers. So they have high glycolytic capacity. They're doing lots of glycolysis. So to do that, they have a lot of glycogen in them so that we get glucose in there quickly and easily. And they have a lot of enzymes for glycolysis. They have many glycolytic enzymes. Now, they don't need oxygen particularly because you don't need oxygen for glycolysis. So they don't have myoglobin. They don't need an oxygen store. This is why your white meat in your turkey is white. They don't have that myoglobin giving them that red color. They're larger in diameter, which means they can layer lots of myofibrils in parallel. So lots of sarcomeres in parallel means they can produce more force, greater tension. And they fatigue rapidly, but this means they're going to be really good at big bursts of strong movement, right? So they're going to use greater tension and they can rapidly get this energy because they're just doing that glycolysis step. And we have our intermediate fiber type. So our fast glycolytic fibers were basically our strong, fast ones. Our slow oxidative fibers were our slow, weak, but like longer working ones. Then we have these kind of intermediate ones that still have this word fast in front. Technically, their myosin ATPase is actually a kind of intermediate efficacy. So it's faster than a slow one, but slower than those fast glycolytic fibers. But for those switches, we can think of them as happening faster. But instead of doing glycolysis, which was also a fast, but fast to fatigue process, now we're doing oxidative phosphorylation, which means that we're going to see some of those adaptations for oxidative phosphorylation, including myoglobin, that molecule where we're storing extra oxygen. Okay, so the fast oxidative fibers would have a fast twitch. They'd be relatively strong, so they're intermediate in diameter. They're relatively strong, not as strong as the fast glycolytic ones, but stronger than our slow oxidative ones. They need like an intermediate amount of oxygen, and they are slower to fatigue than our fast glycolytic fibers, but they're more rapid than these slow oxidative fibers. So pretty much on everything, they're in the middle. Yeah. So yeah, we got fast glycolytic, slow oxidative, and then our intermediate are the fast oxidative. So we have this in table form, just comparing our 3 fiber types. So this is just a table showing us how good their oxidative capacity is. So how much oxidative phosphorylation they can do, how much glycolysis they can do, how fast they contract, which is related to what type of myosin ACE activity is going on for the cross-bridge cycling. Shows us how many mitochondria we have, how much blood flow we have in those capillaries, do they have myoglobin, and then how quickly do they fatigue, how big are they, which motor units do we find them in, and how strong are they. So you can see for pretty much almost all of these, we have intermediate in those fast oxidative fibers. But for a couple of things, they are the same as the slow oxidative, basically the ones that involve getting oxygen, right? So if the property of the fiber type has to do with the fact that it needs oxygen, we're going to have the same trait in the fast oxidative as the slow oxidative. But for everything else, we're just going to be kind of middle of the road. Okay. If we think about actual exercise and physical movements, realistically, every muscle is a mixture of fiber types. And what fiber type you have predominantly, part of it is dependent upon your training. We'll see that we can convert some of these back and forth. Part of it is genetic. So if you do genetic testing, it'll actually kind of tell you which fiber type you're likely to have more of. And the proportions in any given muscle are going to vary depending on what type of function you're doing here. So for example, postural muscles, so muscles that are always a little bit active, right? Like the ones that are kind of holding you up all the time in your back, right? As you're standing or sitting. We can't have them fatigue quickly, right? You don't want to just like fall over after you've been sitting up for 5 minutes. That wouldn't be any good. So postural muscles, for example, would have slow oxidative fibers. So they don't need to create a ton of strength, a ton of tension, but they do need to work for really long periods of time. And it's fine if they need oxygen, right? Like we don't need to have big diameter, strong fibers. So it's fine if they have little skinny fibers that are adapted for oxygen. However, when we're thinking about a muscle, a mixture of fiber types, but we're thinking about a motor unit within that muscle, each motor unit will just be doing one muscle fiber type. Right? So that is part of why we have like different forces corresponding to different size motor units. It has to do with the number of muscle fibers, but also has to do with the fact that they are physically different types of fibers. So our recruitment order is the same as our recruitment order was in terms of number of muscle fibers, but now we know what fiber types they are as well. So our slow oxidative fibers, our little fragile, delicate ones, go first. That's our small motor unit. Then our fast oxidative fibers. Those are those ones that are intermediate in everything, but they do need oxygen. Go second. And then finally, our fast glycolytic fibers are recruited third. Those are those large motor units. And the fibers will physically be large because they don't need oxygen. They're doing glycolysis. We're going to have really fast twitches happening here. This means that we can also separate what type of fiber we're going to be using in different types of exercises. As we've been kind of doing the reverse as we go through fiber types, I've been mentioning when you would likely be using these, but we could divide it from the other direction. So when we're thinking about resistance to fatigue, if we're doing a high intensity exercise, we're going to be using our glycolytic fibers. So say you are sprinting real fast, right? Or maybe doing squats or something. So something high energy intensity, something that takes a lot out of you. We're doing glycolysis, so we have those fast glycolytic fibers. They're building up lactate, okay, which means they're going to be relatively quick to fatigue. But because they're physically big fibers, because glycolytic fibers are physically big, this means they have strong contractions. Now, this is kind of interesting. So the fact that we have really strong contractions and those muscles are bunching up, those muscles are running next to blood vessels, right? So as these muscles strongly contract, that physically compresses the blood vessels, which means that we don't have that much oxygen coming to these fibers, which is fine because they're glycolytic fibers, but it's just another part of why we can't have something with a super strong contraction and a super large diameter that does oxidative phosphorylation, right? The fact that we're doing strong contractions kind of prevents the blood flow. Okay? That's why it's hard to combine those things. Part of fatigue happening in high intensity exercises has to do with neuromuscular fatigue, which basically means we're kind of using up our acetylcholine, right? So our neurotransmitter, we're kind of running out of it. We do have altered enzyme activity as we're doing our high intensity exercises. So we are trying to do more and more glycolysis. We fatigue quickly because of this buildup of lactate, but also because we're running out of acetylcholine, we're running out of blood flow, all sorts of things. But the recovery is actually relatively quick. So the recovery time for these high intensity exercises with our glycolytic fibers happens in minutes to hours, which we're going to see is different than when we end up with fatigue in a slower process. In a low intensity exercise, we're going to deplete our energy reserves, right? So say we're thinking about some low oxidative fibers, right? We're using oxygen, we keep using them and using them and using them and using them, and eventually they run out of energy. Okay. It may be better to think about our intermediate fibers. So let's say we were talking about a fast oxidative fiber, right? Because we've got glycogen here. It's going to take a longer time to recover from these low intensity exercises once we hit that fatigue point. For example, we need to build up that glycogen again. That takes some time, right? It's just a fact. It takes more time to recover from. Another thing that adds into fatigue that we don't really have a physiological explanation for, as far as I know, is psychological fatigue. So actually your willpower, your will to win, does influence how fast you fatigue. And this is especially true for these low intensity exercises, right? Because we're not having that neuromuscular fatigue in the same way. We're not like running out of a neurotransmitter causing our muscle to go limp, right? So we kind of can keep doing it, maybe, if we try really hard. Right. So here's a picture of what the stimuli will look like in fatigue, and you may have seen these in phys lab. So here's what it would look like at the top if we had no fatigue. Here in the center, we can see what's happening with fatigue. So we get weaker and weaker as we're hitting that fatigue point. We can see that these were all at kind of a peak, so we were in tetanus. And then if we were to rest a little, we could have those strong contractions again, but we'd likely hit the fatigue point sooner. Finally, we can convert our different types of fibers. Okay, so in aerobic exercise, we increase the oxidative capacity right? As we practice doing these long activities, so like running a marathon or something, you can actually convert some of the fast glycolytic fibers into fast oxidative fibers. So notice that we're converting a fast fiber to a fast fiber. So what we can change is the number of enzymes, the number of mitochondria. What we can't do is convert what type of myosin we have. So we have to convert fast to fast because that has to do with what type of myosin is present in that fiber. But the sort of cell machinery we can vary. So we would see an increase in the size and number of the mitochondria. We'd see it change size a bit. We'd see a change in the number of blood vessels going to it. And vice versa for the high intensity exercise. So we could also convert some fast oxidative fibers to fast glycolytic fibers if we were practicing high intensity activities. Finally, one quick minute on, we'll start with muscle next time. All right. Have a great Thanksgiving, everyone. And I will see you next week.